It was past 2 in the morning in San Francisco. The bars had closed and people were filtering into the nearest diner, finding seats, ordering coffee. At one table, a young man sat alone with a pen and a napkin. He was drawing animals, small and careful, and genuinely impressive. A man nearby noticed them and said so. They started talking. They left together. By morning, the man who had admired those drawings was in a hospital. The artist was gone. And here's the part that makes this story different from most. By the time investigators understood exactly who they were looking for, they had already found him. What they could not do was stop him. That answer begins in San Francisco in 1974. San Francisco in 1974 was already stretched thin, with the Zodiac case still unsolved and the zebra attacks pushing 16 homicide investigators well beyond their capacity. When a man was found seriously harmed on Ocean Beach in the early hours of January 27, 1974, it was logged and worked alongside everything else already demanding attention. The man was Gerald Kavanaugh, 50 years old, a Canadian-born worker who had made San Francisco his home and who spent his evenings in the social spaces of the Castro and Tenderloin neighborhoods. He carried a Timex watch and a small amount of cash when he was found. There was no identification on him, and he became temporarily one of several unidentified individuals recorded that year in San Francisco. It took investigators 2 days to connect him to a name. The San Francisco Chronicle ran a brief item on page 42 asking for public assistance in identifying him. Nobody came forward. The anonymous caller who had reported Gerald that night never appeared either. Investigators believed he had been at that beach for the same reason Gerald was, and that making himself known would have exposed him in ways that could cost him his job, his housing, and every relationship he had carefully built. He chose silence. To understand this case, you have to understand what it meant to be a gay man in San Francisco in 1974. The Castro and Tenderloin offered community and belonging, but the police department had a long history of hostility toward those spaces, and being associated with them could cost a person their career, their family, and everything they had built. Going to the police was simply not a safe option for most people in that community, and the person who came to be known as the Doodler understood that completely. He operated inside those same bars and diners, sat at the same tables, and had correctly calculated that the people most likely to have seen him were the least likely to speak about it. 5 months after Gerald Kavanaugh was found on Ocean Beach, a man named Joseph Stevens was discovered on a path beside Spreckles Lake in Golden Gate Park, approximately 1.5 miles from where Gerald had been found. Joseph was 27 years old and known throughout the Castro community as Jay, a performer and entertainer who had built a genuine and loyal following in the neighborhood. He had a regular show at a club on Polk Street and had recently secured a headline booking at a well-known and respected venue in North Beach. He stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, was careful about his personal safety in a neighborhood where he understood the risks, and was not the kind of person who took unnecessary chances. He was found with serious injuries on the path. A witness had seen him leave a club the previous night in conversation with a tall, slim young man whose face he had not clearly seen. 10 days later, a woman walking her dog along Ocean Beach in the early morning found Klaus Christmann, 31 years old, a German national who had come to San Francisco several months earlier to establish a life that he planned to eventually bring his wife and 2 young children into from Germany. He was last seen at a club in the Tenderloin the night before he was found. The nature of his injuries was considerably more serious than in the previous cases. Klaus Christmann's family in Germany received a telegram. They had been expecting letters about the new life he was building. They received 7 words instead. Almost a full year passed after that. Then, in May 1975, Frederick Capon was found on Ocean Beach, approximately 1 block from where Gerald Kavanaugh had been found 16 months earlier. Frederick was 32 years old, a registered nurse working at a San Francisco hospital, and a Navy veteran who had served as a combat medic during the Vietnam War. He had called his sister earlier that year to tell her the city felt unsafe and that he was planning to relocate somewhere she could actually come and visit him comfortably. She never had the chance to make that trip. Less than a month after Frederick was found, a hiker near Lincoln Park discovered Harold Gullberg, 66 years old, a Swedish-born merchant seaman who had made San Francisco his permanent home over many years at sea. Nobody had reported Harold missing because there was nobody close enough in his life to notice he was gone. Then in April 1975, between those 2 cases, a man named Warren Andrews was found seriously harmed near Land's End, a clifftop area overlooking the ocean. He never recovered. He passed away weeks later without ever being able to speak to investigators about what had happened to him that night. 6 individuals across 18 months, all in the same city, all connected to the same social spaces, all found in parks, on the waterfront, or along the city's coastal areas. The connection was visible the moment anyone looked at all 6 cases together. The problem was that nobody looked at them together for longer than it should have taken. In the summer of 1975, a man arrived at a San Francisco medical facility, having been seriously harmed. He had made his way there himself from a nearby high-rise apartment building on Market Street. He was alive. He did not want to file a police report. He was a European diplomat stationed in San Francisco and was deeply afraid of what disclosure would mean for his career and his government posting. He eventually agreed to speak with investigators on the strict condition that his identity would be fully and permanently protected. His account gave this case the name it has carried ever since. He had been at a diner on Market Street when a young man nearby caught his attention, drawing small animals on a napkin with careful, skilled strokes. They struck up a conversation and eventually left together. Once at the diplomat's apartment, a confrontation followed, and the diplomat was seriously harmed before his visitor left. He survived and described his attacker as a young black man, tall and slim, between 19 and 23 years old, with high cheekbones and a calm that felt deliberate rather than natural. 2 more survivors came forward around the same time. One lived in the same apartment building as the diplomat, on the same floor, and had survived a similar encounter when neighbors heard sounds from the apartment and building security responded in time. The other was a well-known American entertainer whose name investigators chose not to release, someone whose public career could not have survived the disclosure of his presence in those social spaces. In his case, a concealed tool had fallen from the attacker's clothing during the encounter, and he had been able to leave immediately. He departed San Francisco not long afterward and had no further contact with law enforcement regarding the matter. All 3 survivors could describe their attacker in precise detail. All 3 knew exactly who he was. Not one of them was willing to say so in a courtroom, and nobody who understood their situation could honestly say they did not understand why. In October 1975, lead investigators Rotia Guilford and Earl Sanders worked with a sketch artist using the diplomat's detailed and consistent description to produce a composite image of the suspect. Tips came in quickly once the image was public. An anonymous woman called with a first name. She called back 10 days later, frustrated that nothing visible had happened, and this time provided a home address, an age range, and a license plate number. A secretary at a hospital in the East Bay called to say that her employer had recognized the sketch immediately. 3 days after that, the employer himself called. He was a practicing psychiatrist. His patient had admitted to the attacks during a therapy session, he said. He had no doubt whatsoever about the identification. Investigators now had a name, an address, a license plate, a psychiatric disclosure, and 3 witnesses who could identify the suspect directly. They brought him in for a formal interview in January 1976, and he came in voluntarily, without a lawyer, sitting down across from Guilford and Sanders with complete composure. The suspect sat across from Guilford and Sanders and answered their questions with apparent ease and no visible anxiety. He told them he had struggled with his personal identity since his early teens. He acknowledged that he had sought help from a therapist and said that the sessions had resolved the internal conflict he had been carrying. He mentioned that he had a girlfriend and that his life had moved in a different direction. He said he had changed. Then he denied being the person they were looking for, thanked the investigators for their time, stood up from the chair, and walked out the front door of the San Francisco Police Department as a free man. Guilford later told the San Francisco Chronicle that the man's own description of his background and experiences matched the investigative profile they had built so precisely that there was no doubt in his mind about who he was speaking to. That certainty, however, was not evidence that a court could use. What Guilford and Sanders had assembled was, by any ordinary standard of investigation, a compelling case. What they did not have was anything that could survive the specific legal requirements of a criminal prosecution. The psychiatric disclosure was protected by confidentiality laws between a therapist and patient. While those laws had been updated in 1975 to include a duty to warn in situations of ongoing threat, translating a therapist's phone call into admissible courtroom evidence was an entirely different legal question, and the answer to that question was not a favorable one. The anonymous woman who had called twice with the suspect's name, address, and license plate had never identified herself and could not be subpoenaed or called as a witness. That left only the 3 survivors. The diplomat had identified the suspect from a photograph collection and had no hesitation in doing so privately. But he would not go further. He was not willing to have his name, his presence in those social spaces, or any detail of his personal life become part of a public legal record that could reach his government. The second survivor refused any process that might expose his identity. The entertainer had already left the city. All 3 of them were willing to say, in private, to investigators they trusted, that they knew exactly who had done this to them. None of them could say it publicly in a courtroom without consequences that the world they were living in made genuinely unbearable. Harvey Milk, who was building toward his eventual election to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, spoke about this situation directly and publicly. He said he understood the position those survivors were in. He said the pressure that society had placed on them was real, and that their choice deserved to be respected. The investigation went cold. The suspect left San Francisco. The cases went into the files, and the structural forces that had protected this person from the beginning continued doing so long after he was gone. In 2017, San Francisco Police Department Inspector Dan Cunningham formally reopened the case and began a complete review of everything that had been gathered across 4 decades. What he found was a record preserved in fragments. Files had been separated from their documentation during moves between departments over the years. Evidence had been stored in ways that disconnected it from the context that gave it meaning. Notes referenced names and locations that no longer matched anything in active databases. Cunningham later described working from the very beginning as an advantage rather than a limitation. because starting completely fresh forced him to examine connections and patterns that earlier investigators had either missed or passed over while working with incomplete information under the pressures of active cases. The primary suspect from the 1970s was still alive. He was living in the East Bay, not far from San Francisco. According to reporting by the San Francisco Chronicle, he had been living openly as a gay man for a number of years, a detail that carries its own weight given what investigators have long believed about the internal conflict that shaped his behavior during those 18 months in 1974 and 1975. Cunningham interviewed him in 2018. The man said precisely what he had said to Guilford and Sanders 42 years earlier. He denied any involvement in the cases. He was composed, cooperative in manner, and gave nothing away. During the course of that 2018 interview, investigators collected a DNA sample from the suspect, without his awareness that they were doing so. That sample was then compared against biological material recovered and preserved from the original scenes in the 1970s. No public announcement of a match or a result has been made as of the most recent available reporting. The reinvestigation ran into the same fundamental obstacle that had stopped the original investigation, now appearing in a different form 50 years later. The only surviving record of the psychiatrist who had called police in 1975 was a handwritten note in Rotia Guilford's case files that read Dr. Priest, psychiatrist, Highland Hospital, East Bay. When Cunningham searched for any record of a practicing psychiatrist by that name at Highland Hospital during the relevant period, he found nothing that matched. The hospital had no record of anyone by that name. A journalist working alongside the reinvestigation later identified a possible match in Dr. Howard Priest, whose professional history and practice background aligned closely with the description in Guilford's notes. But Dr. Priest had passed away in 2005. His patient records were held by the hospital and were not accessible without a court order. Cunningham sought that court order. The judge reviewing the request declined it, stating that the available evidence did not establish that the former patient continued to represent a threat to public safety, sufficient to override the confidentiality that still applied to those records even after the therapist's death. The records remain inaccessible. In 2019, the San Francisco Police Department announced a public reward of $100,000 for information leading to a formal arrest in connection with these cases. That reward was subsequently increased to $250,000, where it stands today. The department also took the significant step of releasing, for the very first time, the original audio recording of the anonymous 911 call made in the early morning hours of January 27, 1974. The call that first brought officers to Ocean Beach and to Gerald Kavanaugh. Investigators hoped that someone, somewhere, might recognize the voice of the caller who had never come forward. The caller has still not been identified. Rotia Guilford and Earl Sanders are two of the most important figures in this case, and they deserve more recognition than the official record has given them. Guilford became the first African-American officer to lead the SFPD Homicide Division. Sanders became the department's eventual chief of police. Within the Castro and Tenderloin communities, they were known as the Soul Brothers, a name given with genuine respect by people who had every reason to distrust the institution they represented. What set them apart was their approach. Rather than working from a distance, they went inside those spaces, sat in the bars, spoke to regulars, and came back repeatedly until people trusted them enough to share what they knew. Every major development in the investigation came through that trust. Guilford carried this case for the rest of his career, speaking about it to journalists years later with the same certainty he had in 1976. He never stopped believing they had the right person. 6 people lost their lives across those 18 months in San Francisco. 3 survivors knew exactly who was responsible and could not safely say so in public. A psychiatrist reported a patient confession, and the legal system had no clean way to use it. An anonymous woman called the police twice with the suspect's name and address, and then disappeared back into the city. 2 of the most capable investigators in the department's history sat across from the man they were certain had done all of this, watched him answer their questions calmly, and watched him walk out the door. That was 1976. The same man was interviewed again in 2018. He walked out that door too. The case is still open. The reward is still active at $250,000, and the detective assigned to this case has not stopped working. Sometimes justice moves slower than anyone involved deserves. Sometimes it has not arrived yet. Every week on this channel, we cover the cases that reveal how the system works and where it falls short. If this story held your attention all the way through, subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. These are the cases that deserve to be fully understood, not just briefly remembered. Subscribe and stay with us.